Support for Disrupted comes from the Connecticut Office of Film, Television, and Digital Media.
The way people teach U.S. history has come under fire in recent years. Across the country, politicians are debating what history should be taught in the classroom.
The controversy over Florida's new education standards is intensifying.
Speaker Cameron Sexton rejected the push to teach more Black history in Tennessee schools.
There's a huge fight taking place in Texas, in the legislature specifically, over what should or shouldn't be taught in history and social studies classes.
But these debates aren't just happening in states like Texas. They're also taking place here in Connecticut.
Native American history is finally coming to Connecticut schools, but there are already tensions about what to teach and how to teach it.
So what do the people who teach and study history think about all the debate? From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking about U.S. history and how we teach it in all its complexity. That was the topic of a live event I hosted with the Connecticut Forum. That conversation happened less than 2 weeks after the 2024 presidential election. I was joined by an outstanding group of Connecticut historians and educators. Chris Newell is co-founder and director of education for Acoma Educational Initiative. He's also founding director of the Native American Cultural Program and instructor in residence at the University of Connecticut. Chris is a citizen of the Passamaquoddy tribe at Indian Township. Fiona Vernal is director of engaged public, oral, and community histories and associate professor of history and Africana studies at the University of Connecticut. And Andy Horowitz is Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut and the Connecticut State Historian. His work looks at disasters and the broader implications they hold for society. I started the conversation by asking Andy what it means for him to be an historian.
Well, I feel like we should just start by being honest. I mean, sitting in my pajamas for as long as possible late in the day, reading books that haven't been checked out of the library for many, many years, trying to discover if that's because I'm the only genius who thought to read that book or the only idiot who went through the trouble to take it out. That's what it looks like usually on a Monday. And then frantically putting on a shirt like this for the Zoom meeting. I call that the Zoom mullet, the business on top and the pajamas on the bottom. And yet, as I do that work in my pajamas, history is quite a strange business because on the one hand, it's the most empirical of sciences. We only write about things that actually happened. Statisticians will tell you, usually, in general, this is what happened. The anthropologists will tell you, in general in this society, a person of this type would do this kind of thing. Historians won't stand for any of that. We say, this person did this thing on this date, and we have to have proof. On the one hand. On the other hand, our work is suffused with imagination, and we have to make stuff up all the time. There's a famous example from an ancient essay by R.J. Collingwood about a ship. It says the historian might know that the ship was over here on one day and know that it was over there on the next. How do you know that it sailed in a straight line from one point to the next? You don't. You have to use your imagination, and again, we have to summon those powers of imagination, and even in the questions we ask. You ask me for a picture of Hartford, I could show you a man eating a $100 steak at Max downtown or a man sleeping under a piece of cardboard out around the corner. Those are both true stories about Hartford. They're empirical facts, but obviously they're driven by our own questions.
Fiona, a lot of your work is also helping people to tell their stories, to affirm that they do indeed have stories to tell. And you help people see connections across experience, across generations, in ways that I think sometimes the frenetic pace of our society doesn't always allow for. So you are very intentional about creating that. What does it mean for you to be an historian and the way that you approach that role?
Well, my family says I have the gift of gab, and I had to figure out an outlet for that skill set. But, when I was growing up, I was supposed to be an engineer, right? I was young, Black, I was really smart, I was really good at math and science, and I was supposed to be an engineer, but I asked questions of my family incessantly. I was very annoying. Why are these men going to the US to cut sugarcane or to work in tobacco in our very own Connecticut? How come women aren't going? How come they come back so quickly? How come they just come back in a couple of months? And I didn't know that history would become an outlet for answering those questions. I was just an annoying child, and I landed in college, and a professor told me, you can do anything that you want. Your parents don't need to be involved. And as a West Indian person, that is anathema, right? To say that your parents don't need to be involved. But I essentially found my voice in the gift of gab. I was introduced to oral histories at a very early stage in my undergraduate career when I was a sophomore, and I thought it was so illuminating because it helped me to just have conversations and to have that become evidence and to be able to leverage those conversations and turn that into narratives and stories that could persuade people, that could bring joy to people, that could help people see that they were a part of history. I mean, we've all grown up with this great man view of history, right? And even growing up, I didn't necessarily understand how my own family was connected in the migration to the US. But through conducting oral histories, whether in Hartford, whether in South Africa, whether in Jamaica, I've been able to use that particular historical method to bring all kinds of stories to life.
So there's hope for every student who talks too much, asks too many questions on their report card. I may have been one of those students too, and we made it through. Chris, your approach is also about affirming connection, but also correcting the record to affirm the histories, the dignity of people, and the ability for people to tell their own stories, their own histories on their own terms. Talk to us about your view of your role and how that is so tied to who you are as a person.
When it comes to myself, I take this as a family legacy in a lot of ways. My great-great-grandfather was a man named Louis Mitchell, who served for the Passamaquoddy tribe in the 19th century on the state legislature, and also developed his own writing system for our language back at that time, and did a lot of recording of our history, and was actually, in his own way, our first conservator. And along that line, my grandmother kind of took up a lot of that just within the community, passed it to my father. And what I tell people about, my education, I only have a bachelor's degree from UConn, a Bachelor of General Studies, but I went to the school of Wayne Newell, is what I tell people. My father, graduated from Harvard in 1971 with a master's in education, one of the first Native recruits back when they first started what they call the American Indian Program. He was one of what they call the original 11. He was very much affected by the Civil Rights era at that time, because before the Civil Rights era, he had been so used to the oppression that he thought that what he was experiencing was normal. And so I saw my father in his own life story do things like go to the city of Boston, enter Emerson College and places like that, eat in restaurants for the first time in his life as an adult, and get himself to a point where he could talk about our histories in a way that non-Native people, non-Passamaquoddy people could understand. And watching that connection and seeing how people were able to absorb it and learn from it is something that I kind of just literally, absorbed from the kitchen table conversations that happened within my own home. And it's not something I could have gotten at a college campus or in a classroom. And so for me, it's really about carrying on that legacy because our own people need to have our histories told. One of the things that America has done a really good job of is erasing Native histories, especially here in the state of Connecticut. And one of the things I want to see is a future where my children grow up understanding that their peers all understand their history. And they stop getting asked questions like, I thought we killed you all, or, things like that, which actually still happen to this day.
I want to thank you, Chris, for reminding us that sometimes telling our stories can help other people tell theirs, and to realize that the shame and stigma of not knowing is not yours to bear. It is of others to figure that out. Andy, your introduction talked about you are a scholar of disasters. So let's talk about election 2024 a little bit in the context of history. We often hear people say these are unprecedented times. These are polarizing times. We've never faced anything like this. And my historian friends make the face that all three of you are like, have you been paying attention? But for some people, it seems like hyperbole. And for others, it is, what do we make of this moment? Where do you look to for understanding of this current moment? Is there an historical era, person, event that you think of to help others make sense of this current moment?
Well, I don't really use history by analogy. I don't think that our moment is like some other moment. I don't know if you do this differently, but I don't think that our moment is like some other moment that gives me any kind of predictive power over what's going to happen next. But I think especially for those of us who feel that like our present has come out of nowhere, rather than asking, what is our moment like, it's productive just to ask, what moment are we in? How do you tell a story that makes the present make sense? And when I look back from the present to try to, ask what moment we're in, I kind of date it to the collapse of what was called the New Deal order that from, the sort of governed American politics and political culture from Roosevelt in the 30s through the 70s. And it collapsed and gave rise to Ronald Reagan, who, some of you may know, ran for president in 1980 on the slogan. You know what his slogan was in 1980? Make America Great Again. Yeah, and in his first inaugural, he said, in our present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Setting a frame for governmental critique that Democrats picked right up. You may remember this, I think it was the first State of the Union when Bill Clinton said the era of big government's over, the new Democrat. And Reagan put together, it wasn't him, he was a product of a coalition that brought together corporate interests that abhorred taxation and regulation, brought in white people who opposed civil rights and government services for non-white people, evangelicals who opposed abortion and gay rights, and included a kind of, diffuse fringe of often conspiratorial. You could start a little earlier with the John Birch Society because they opposed, fluoride in the water, like the new Health and Human Services nominee, the chair for a nominee does today, or Pat Buchanan in 1992, who popularized the phrase of a culture war, talk about polarization. If you tell the history of my lifetime, past 40 odd years that way, Donald Trump doesn't just, not seem surprising. He seems inevitable. And when you put it that way, so that has some explanatory power to me. But I want to say just one more word about that, because I've accidentally now said that Donald Trump seems inevitable. And historians are allergic to the idea of inevitability, just as much as we are to the idea of something being unprecedented. And this is the trap of looking backwards from the present. Because, of course, everything that happened seems like it led inexorably to this moment. But that's not how good historians work. Good historians work looking forward. And when you view things forward, you realize that in the same way that we have no idea what's going to happen, that's because you're actually thinking like a wise historian. You know how many things could go one way or another. I have lots of fulcrum moments that I hold on to as examples for students. One that sticks in my mind just because it's a good one for me is December 12th, 2000. If Sandra Day O'Connor had voted with the other four justices in the case of Bush versus Gore, affirming the Florida Supreme Court decision to keep counting those votes in the 2000 election, then Al Gore would have won the popular and the electoral college votes, and we would have had the climate change guy as president in 2000. So there's a fulcrum moment potentially for human history. And or 40,000 votes go the other way in 3 states out of 140 million votes cast in 2016. And the whole history of the past decade is different. So, I think good historians, we can explain the present, but we shouldn't over-explain because you risk obscuring what to me is history's most vital lesson, which is that things might have been different, and we don't know what's going to happen next.
Fiona, I had the opportunity to be in conversation with Senator Joe Lieberman about 2 weeks before he passed away. And I asked him, what did you learn from failure? What did you learn from the election of 2000? We were having this really great convo, and I looked at a student who looked bewildered. And it occurred to me, this young person wasn't even alive during the 2000 election. And so they had lots of questions because it didn't make sense the way we were talking about it, because that history seemed foreign to them. How are you having conversations with your students or other scholars as an historian when people talk about this moment and that context?
If I were going to try to answer part of the question that you asked, Andy, I would only go to the 2016 election because students were ready to discuss. They were outraged. There were protests on campus. Students on both sides, students who voted for Trump, students who did not, were ready to engage each other in debate and dialogue. We have a really robust program of dialogic engagement at UConn through Democracy and Dialogue series. Hundreds and hundreds of UConn students have been trained through my colleague Brendan Kane's initiative. And so in lots of ways, I think those students were truly prepared. And then I watched those same students get really galvanized when George Floyd was murdered, and again came out in full force to call each other out. When students are harassing each other and writing the word on their dorm mates' doors and doing harassing things in the bathroom to be really hostile. Our students were truly engaged, and this week, campus was quiet, and it's frightening. And it's not just the students who are quiet. The brief postmortem that we've had as faculty in terms of how to support our students, the conversations have gone in this direction. How do we prepare to get doxxed? How do we prepare to talk to UConn police about our security? My unit in particular has been tasked with teaching an anti-Black racism course that our university senate and the board of trustees have already signed off on. And we're going to be teaching an anti-Black racism course. We're going to get doxxed. We are not going to be safe. And so to have this tremendous outpouring and a sense of resistance sort of coming up from the students and being there to guide and to facilitate and to listen and to have crickets this week and to be preparing to be unsafe is a completely different world for me between 2016 and now. So that's sort of the immediate past that I go to, because in 2016, even if students were not the ones saying, okay, we have a few moderate Republicans who surely will come to their senses and keep things straight, those people are gone. All right, the media will do their job and hold folks accountable. I'm not sure that those guardrails matter anymore. We are in a new future, and we have no idea what it's going to be like. 2016 is a bit of a shadow or a preview, but I am frightened for myself, and I'm frightened for my students. They don't want to talk in class. They don't know if they're being recorded. They don't know if they're going to, that recording is going to be uploaded. Colleagues in my own department have had to have the police posted at their houses, and I have already had colleagues who've been doxxed. Myself, personally, I get harassing phone calls about why don't I teach about the good parts of slavery? Why am I not teaching that China is the biggest slave trader of all time? There was a strange one about China buying Smithfield bacon. I haven't quite figured out that one yet, and why I needed to teach about China and its corporate tentacles in American industries. But these are routine things that we as faculty deal with on a regular basis. They have been ongoing, and we take them in stride, and we hope that civility and trying to persuade folks, even if they don't vote your way, would do the job. And we had good reason to be heartened by 2020, but I'm not sure what's going to happen now, and we are frightened.
That was Fiona Vernal, Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. Chris Newell is co-founder and Director of Education for Acoma Educational Initiative. And Andy Horowitz is Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut and the Connecticut State Historian. This is Disrupted. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're talking with historians and educators about teaching the complexities of the past. Andy Horowitz is Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut and the Connecticut State Historian. Fiona Vernal is Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at UConn. And Chris Newell is co-founder and Director of Education for Acoma Educational Initiative. All three educators were part of a live event I hosted with the Connecticut Forum back in November. Before the break, Fiona spoke about the vulnerability that many people are feeling after the 2024 election. I asked Chris to talk about the parts of history that he's thinking about in this moment.
There's a lot of different eras of federal Indian policy, in teaching Intro to Native American Indigenous Studies, that I teach people about. And oftentimes students are unaware of, the country was not won by defeating Native people, but it was won by signing papers along the way, by treaty. When it comes to the things that I'm focusing on, it is the creation of this country and also recent history, because the country was founded on things like freedom of religion. Yet I was 4 years old when I finally in this country got the right to practice my own traditional religious practices freely. I was born in 1974. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act doesn't pass until 1978. And so for a lot of us, we are living and have lived through very historic moments. Honestly, the Biden administration was a historic moment in and of itself, with the appointment of Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland, Kevin Sams as head of the National Park Service. Native people, I think, we probably got a little bit lulled into sleep that things were going to be better for the good, for the long term. But now, we know that all of those appointments are going to get turned over. And so the Secretary of the Interior, why is that such an important thing? Well, the Secretary of the Interior runs the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And runs and basically controls federal Indian policy within this country. So as a member of a federally recognized tribe, that position oversees my daily life within this country, including land management, amongst other things. And so we're living through in our own lives, I don't think of myself as that old, but in our relatively short lives, we've lived through a lot of history, and this is another of one of those historical moments. And for us to pay attention, because one of the things that people talk about when I teach history is that they have a tendency to think that I focus on hard history. But that's not the truth. I'm just really telling the actual history of what happened to Native people when this country was created. And what we can do with those lessons is not point fingers at each other and say who did wrong, which is what's going on right now, but actually look at those points in history where we as human beings made mistakes, call it out, and then learn from it and do better going forward. And I think that in this last election, we didn't do that. Right? There's a whole lot of not doing that, just not learning from mistakes of the past. So we ended up going backwards, from a very forward-running stance for Native people. We are going back to a president that almost reinstated the termination era of federal Indian policy. So if you know the history, that's the one that precedes what we now call the self-determination era, which started under the Nixon presidency. For tribes to be able to assert their sovereignty. In the termination era, the federal government was actually trying to get rid of tribes. And under Donald Trump's first presidency, the Mashpee Wampanoag people had put some land into trust, and he actually overturned that. He had his Secretary of the Interior overturn that. And that's the first time that that's ever happened in history. And so that was almost like a dog whistle to us as Native people that the termination era is just right there, right around the corner, literally from the decisions of the few people that the president puts in these positions. And so I don't have an era necessarily to compare it to because all of U.S. history has moments like this. But I do remind my students that history is happening right now. And for us to look at and make sure that we understand where mistakes are being made so that the next generation doesn't have to suffer for what we're doing right now.
Dr. Eddie Glaude said that one of the reasons that people are so hesitant or afraid, if that's the word, of really knowing the complexity and fullness of history is that once you know that, it forces you to confront something inside. And you start to see what your role is in that. What are those kinds of stories of power, of agency, of control that we need to be thinking about more so that it's not just some abstract thing that happens in Florida or happens somewhere else, but we really think about history, the complexity right here in our state?
We're about to enter another time period where, yes, we are in a blue state and we can kind of pat ourselves on the back, but a lot of things are coming our way. When I think about the current generation, my son at 22, 25, they don't know anything about how the government works, whether the local government or the federal government. And that's just the general state of the public. Do you guys know that over 400,000 kids in Head Start are touched by the Department of Education, right? What's going to happen to those programs? And so when it comes to the bad news or good news, I think this is good news. This is an opportunity. This is a wake-up call to ask us, how come we don't know anything about how our country works civically? How come we don't know anything about how our institutions work? How come we don't know how the Department of Education is structured and who's actually going to be impacted if it goes away, right? Not just the kids who are in college. And it's an opportunity for us to stop delegating the responsibility for understanding what is going on in our communities and in our state and in the country to others. Like somebody else out there is going to take care of that for us. It all falls on us. So this is sort of a clarion call to all of us, right, to pay better attention. We have the 22-year-olds and the 25-year-olds who are malleable, and that gives me hope. Their eyes are wide open and they are paying attention. What are we going to teach them?
That was Fiona Vernal, Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. Chris Newell is co-founder and director of education for Acoma Educational Initiative. And Andy Horowitz is the Connecticut State Historian. Coming up, our guests talk about doing things that make you uncomfortable. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. This hour, we're exploring controversies surrounding teaching U.S. history today. Andy Horowitz is Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut and the Connecticut State Historian. Fiona Vernal is Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. And Chris Newell is co-founder and Director of Education for Acoma Educational Initiative. I asked Chris about working in education while seeing so many attacks on the very value and purpose of education.
I feel like in some ways I'm a disruption. That's
a good term. I really like it. Fridays at 9 a.m. on Connecticut Public. Thank you.
Because I wrote a book for Scholastic, of all places, and I've never written a children's book in my life up until that point. And Scholastic is, we've all, done the Scholastic book fairs or had kids that, come home with the papers and say, please, give me my $10, and it was probably more than that these days. But, I used to love the Scholastic book fairs. That was a memory for me. And so, how I got into that project was literally because of who I know. The archive librarian there is a friend of mine that I went to Dartmouth College with, and when this particular project came up, it was a rewrite of several books that were released in the 70s called If You Lived During the American Revolution, If You Lived During the Civil War, and the first original book was called If You Lived During the First Thanksgiving. And so she knew that I had been teaching this material for years, about more than just the feast that happened, the history that happened before, the history that happened after. And so when I came to that project, she basically said, this is the guy that has to write this book. And I stayed away from him at first because I'm not Wampanoag. It's not my history to tell. But the way the book world works, somebody else was going to get it, and they were likely not going to be Wampanoag. So I said, well, okay, wait a minute. I'm going to get in there, and I'm going to get in this space that I'm not normally used to, and I'm going to, disrupt what's been going on, with these older books, because that original book is problematic. From the 70s, If You Lived During the First Thanksgiving. It's very problematic. It's about 90% about the English and barely any mention of the Wampanoag people at all. So I wanted to write something that, where Wampanoag people who suffer the same fate as Pequot people in Massachusetts, in that when somebody meets them that is non-Wampanoag, they're often surprised that they're still alive, because the Mayflower narrative has put them in the past only, and they've only been written about in the past tense. And I wanted to create a book that a Wampanoag person, I really could care less about what Scholastic thought at that point. I really wanted to create a book that a Wampanoag person would say, you know what, before you ask me that silly question you're about to ask me, which is going to make it awkward for you and me, right? Here's this kid's book, right? And let's start from there. And I really wrote it not with just the kids in mind, the second and fifth graders that it was intended for, but with parents and teachers in mind as well, because they have been taught this history wrong since the 19th century. Essentially, the Pilgrim narrative that we all grew up with friendly natives and pilgrims getting along was somewhat propagandized, information that came about during Lincoln's presidency after the Civil War. It was a way to try to bring the country together. So I really was about disrupting that, because I wanted my living Wampanoag friends and relatives to be able to have something on print, right, that would answer those questions ahead of time. Because what I tell people about this country is that we talk about, religious freedom and things of that sort, but what I tell people is that what the English brought was not necessarily Christianity, it was the religion of the paper document. and what paper documents for us as Americans mean, right? You know, the U.S. Constitution is almost held up as if God wrote it himself, right? In some people's minds, we don't own a package of gum from the store unless we get the receipt. Right? So we live in this religion of paper document. We don't own our houses unless we have a piece of paper that says so, and all of these types of things. Books are written on paper, and so therefore are highly trusted. And so, you know, I put myself in a very uncomfortable position to write that book, but at the same time, I knew that it would have an impact over a long period of time, because the books that I read from my childhood definitely affect how I think today. And a lot of those books were recommended to me by my dad, who also was disrupting history for me at a very young age.
I want to ask each of you a question that will seem really big and complex, but you have to answer it in a really short amount of time. Andy Chris said he put himself in an uncomfortable place to do this good thing, to do this important thing. As people leave tonight after the Q&A, what would you say is something that we should consider doing that may be uncomfortable but can help us move to a better place?
Two-part quick answer. One is, okay. Sometimes one has to think before you speak. Maybe that's the lesson to take away. It's amazing the power, and this is going to sound really pat, but especially, you know, I don't think we want to get into, nor do I necessarily want to deploy the notions of fascism or these various words we have flying around. But certainly I think, regardless, even nothing to do with the election, our digital existence, our animized personal algorithmic news feeds and all of that has built on a century of what most scholars describe as just sort of a capitalist assault on community. And it leaves you weak and easy to rule, lonely and spiritually vacant. In that context, simply showing up to be in a room with other people is actually quite a heroic act. And, you know, I think, you know, this is clearly the most insignificant thing you could do, but to me, the first step is just show up for more stuff. Don't just watch the thing on Zoom with your camera off. Come to the thing in person. Maybe talk to somebody you didn't meet before. That alone is like such a kind of hedge against these world historical forces that are pushing us the other way. And the other part of my answer is, you know, you said what's something uncomfortable. I don't think that doing the right thing, certainly showing up, it shouldn't make you feel uncomfortable. It usually feels much better. Usually it's doing the wrong thing is what's deeply uncomfortable. You know, the lie is uncomfortable. People talk about it's hard history. Lies are hard history. The truth is actually quite a relief. You know something's wrong. You go to the doctor, you can't tell what's wrong. The doctor gives you a diagnosis. Usually it's, oh, that's what it, you know, it's like that's the feeling. And certainly if it's something as pleasurable as showing up and making a new friend or ally, I mean, that's a pleasurable thing. So I think it's the opposite of an uncomfortable thing to do. Fiona will give you the bitter medicine, but mine is just go to a party. You know, that's my answer.
Fiona, what would you offer?
In my circles, the conversations that have been taking place are that the Trump voters are stupid, racist, misogynist. There's a lot of name calling about the people who voted for Trump. And so the really hard thing is going to be to figure out how to live with our neighbors who didn't vote the way that we voted. I mean, every election cycle, somebody loses, and we have to figure out how to live with each other and live with the other side. That's going to be really difficult, but now a significant majority of us are going to have to figure this out. As we,
a significant minority of us. Just
a significant minority of us.
Who we are going to have to. I'm just thinking about the popular vote.
Yeah. So you didn't get to see this because you work here in Hartford most of the time, but as the election got closer, the yard signs became flagpoles, right? And it's really hard to have that be my entry point to work every day, right? I've considered not stopping at the gas station in Coventry and not engaging. But then I changed my mind. I said, I'm going to have to figure out how to live with people who have voted in a very different way than I voted, and how to understand that, come to terms with that. And most importantly for me as a professor, I don't think my classroom space is safe anymore.
Chris?
Well, once again, I kind of borrow from my father's experience. He was born in 1942, and the reservation in Zibayag where he was raised. No electricity, no running water, and the people that lived outside the reservation, the non-native people, were very racist. To the people, the Passamaquoddy people on the reservation, and so he grew up with a lot of anger, against non-native people. And how did he dissipate that anger? Is really through conversation. And what I'm going to do is give you a little nugget of his. He was really fond, because he learned Passamaquoddy first. That's the language spoken in his house, that he grew up with, and didn't start to learn English till he was 10 plus years old, when he, enrolled himself in the school, because he was legally blind, and so hunting and fishing weren't quite as easy for him as it was for his peers. And so, one of the things, when he started to learn the English language, he started to learn the difference between the worldviews, right, between England and Passamaquoddy people. And one of the things he liked to do is, connect with the audience and redefine English language words with a Passamaquoddy worldview. And one of the things he used to say is that knowledge is not a noun like it is in the English language. To him, knowledge is the energy that occurs between us when we're in conversation. So my encouragement to you all is to create those spaces where conversation can happen, even uncomfortable conversation can happen. So because that energy that you create, right, that's where knowledge is being created. And as by making it into an animate being, as it is seen in our language, then you as a human being can contribute to its life. You can take away from its life. It's your choice, right? You all have the choice in that when you create the space for conversation to happen. And so I would encourage you all as you go forward. In another nugget of his that he said in the last documentary he showed up, Wachikawabuk, if we were to leave an event like this feeling good temporarily, then we've wasted our time. So don't just leave here with good thoughts because you heard from really good people up on this stage. You've met some good people in this room. Go out and meet people you don't know and start those conversations there.
The event ended with an audience Q&A session. One audience member asked how people today can bear witness to current events so that historians can study them in the future.
The oral historian in me says I should apply for a really massive grant to begin interviewing people about this moment and the moments to come, and to train a massive pipeline of people who know how to conduct oral histories, and to create an archive so that the future historians who want to write about this moment will be able to go to that as one source, right? And to be able to compare it to other accounts. I would say, if Andy and I are writing histories now, right? Like, oh my God, the horror of thinking that maybe we're gonna have to go through people's emails. I do not want that to be a primary source. So keep diaries, please. Keep diaries, write letters, get offline, can write letters, keep diaries, and then come up with, a chain of ownership and pass it down to your grandchildren and give them instructions about why these diaries are so important for documenting the now. And I say that in jest, but I am very serious. We had a really amazing project that documented the COVID period, because that too felt like unprecedented unprecedented times, and it has created a massive archive that other scholars are going to be able to turn to. So that's what I would suggest.
I think that's also her way of telling me to print the pictures on my phone and not just let them live in the cloud. Anyone else?
I think sometimes we spend too much time on social media, right? And not enough time being human beings. So that's one of the things I would say is that, reduce your screen time, just like we tell our kids. Right? We're going to tell our kids, let's be the example to that, and let's be human to each other. We can disagree. I have a friend, a friend of mine that teaches at the University of Southern Maine. We disagree on so much, vehemently, yet we're still friends. And I can remember a time in this country, where it felt like, at least when I was a child, in the 80s, it felt like as citizens, it was kind of like all of us citizens against the politicians type of thing. And I remind people of how Dan Quayle oftentimes with his flubs made us all laugh. It didn't matter what side of the aisle that you were on. One of my favorite quotes of his is, I love Southern California, and I practically grew up in Phoenix. So that's the spirit that, that can happen, when we human with each other a little bit more and stop allowing the algorithms of social media to affect, how or lead our thoughts.
Another audience member asked about the historical roots of segregation in Connecticut.
I'll start by just saying that when it comes to the Native communities here, reservations start in the 1600s here in Connecticut. This is the home base of the reservation system. Not, if you read a history book that said 19th century America was the early reservation period, that's totally untrue. It starts here in Connecticut. And as someone that lives on Mashantucket and who has children that go into the public education system not on the reservation, I can say that a lot of that seems to be really goes all the way back to the formation of the state. When you create these boundaries, then that causes separation between people, and then you force them to interact with one another, and that causes sometimes, not the best situation for people. And so my children, have struggled. Both my boys, when they were born and raised as young ones, had long hair, and one of my sons gave up his long hair by the time he was 10 years old. The other one just did last year, up until he was a sophomore in high school. But the fact that he made it at least that far to me in a Connecticut school, says a lot about what he is as a person because of what he had to deal with. It's just not the norm for boys to have long hair here. And so he got teased a lot and a lot of other things like that, for being Pequot, for having long hair, and those types of things. And that really comes up with those ideas of boundaries, of separation. And one of the things I remind people of is that the word Connecticut is not the bordered colony and then state that we think of today. An indigenous understanding of that word, in my language, is Quinnatukut. In the languages down here is Quinatucket. It's the river. It's the river. It means something long and straight. All right? And that's an accurate description of the river. And so in that way, the Connecticut River is currently being used as a boundary between New Hampshire and Vermont. Yet, indigenous understanding of that history is that waterway connected us. Wabanaki people came all the way from our territory way up north in what is now Maine and even in New Brunswick to come down here to trade for wampum beads. And how did we get here? The superhighway of Connecticut. That's how we got here. And I don't want to go on too long about that. But I mean, when you put boundaries in place, that's what happens. But if we can start to rethink those boundaries, that water is not something that separates us, but actually connects us, and get back to an indigenous understanding of that, we could do a lot better for each other. But historically, once we started to put those boundaries in place, that caused a lot of separation, I think, especially with the tribal communities.
If you think about the way that the city of Hartford is structured right now, everybody used to be downtown. Everybody was right on the riverfront. And as people moved away, those were some of the only housing. The oldest and most dilapidated housing was what was available to successive poor communities, working class communities, communities of color. Right now, we're accustomed to the African American population, the North End, but it's segregation by design. This is the kind of language that we see now in the election, for example, the language of contagion and invasion. That's the kind of language that you find in the archives in Hartford's history and in other major cities in Connecticut. And that language wasn't just used for people of color, it was used for all different kinds of immigrant groups. We in the United States and we in Connecticut haven't been very tolerant of people that we other. We have welcomed folks as they have improved socioeconomically, and we tell this story in this country of, the white immigrant population. They're plucky, and in 1 or 2 generations, right, they will take their place in the American story. And those communities get left behind, right? As Italians move out of Hartford, as the Jewish population moves out of Hartford and into West Hartford and into Bloomfield, and leaves the city core for African Americans who are coming from the South, for West Indians, and those narratives, again, of invasion and contagion start all over. And then we drop a highway in between to make sure that you can see Hartford, but you can't make it downtown, because downtown is the commercial business district, and you want to protect white businesses from communities of color. You want to inoculate them. You want to protect them, and the highway serves as a perfect barrier. So the roots of segregation look very similar across Connecticut, and the mechanisms for enforcing that is the highway that we all are really pleased about getting us to where we need to go, but which communities were destroyed by the coming of the highway. And also part of the reason why things are so segregated is the way that we fund our education, the way that we fund our education system, and this commitment that we have to linking education to property taxes. And as long as we continue to do that, nobody is ever going to agree to regionalization. That's never going to happen in Connecticut, as long as it's all about property taxes and who gets to be a taker, right? And who gets to be a contributor. And unfortunately, even in a blue place like Connecticut, we're still living with those legacies of segregation, even as we congratulate ourselves. And I'm afraid I don't see anything on the horizon that's going to look very different. In the current legislative session that's coming up, we are once again going to be submitting bills for affordable housing and for Connecticut's 169 towns, right, to carry their fair share of affordable housing, and it's going to get voted down, right? And so that's part of the reason why the state stays segregated, because we have some feckless legislators who are not brave enough to come up with a very different vision of how we can actually live together and create opportunity zones for everybody.
I would just encourage people that if you are able to serve on a zoning board or commission for your town and your city, that is one way to think about how you change that pattern that, as you said, is a part of cities across the state of Connecticut. The next question asks how we reinforce truth at a time full of false narratives that distort history.
It's the challenge of being a historian. In a way, it's sort of where we started, where you first have to tell the truth is necessary, and often that's the battle you have to simply find out what happened. You study, I happen to study modern U.S., so it's a different story. But sometimes you have the little shard of pottery, and you have to try to recreate the whole society around it. So sometimes figuring out what happened is a big deal. It's usually a little easier for people that are doing the more recent past. But then there's the trouble of telling a story and telling a story that makes sense to people. It's certainly the case that historians ask their questions from the present, and that may sound like a silly thing to say, but the past doesn't change, and the facts of the past don't change, but what we look to it to teach us changes, and the questions we have about it change over time. I've been thinking a lot about Thomas Jefferson recently because we have the 250th, anniversary of the Declaration of Independence coming up. A generation of historians were very interested in how Thomas Jefferson's ideas of freedom were informed by John Locke, the political philosopher. Another generation of later generation of historians want to know how his ideas of freedom were informed by Sally Hemings and his own children who he enslaved. What did freedom mean to that man? Those are actually both quite good questions to ask. And I'm glad that our storehouse of knowledge includes the answers to both. And I say that by way of preamble to saying that clearly the question that we are desperate to ask now, to look into the past, is to say, is multiracial democracy possible? Is it possible for us all to have a robust and emboldened sense of ourselves as individuals and unique communities, but still live together with other people who have that same robust sense of individuality? And it's quite a complicated challenge. Is it possible to live in a world where there can be a few extremely wealthy people and a bunch of people who are broke? And so we look into the past, and we often call this inclusive history, and I think sometimes that feels like identity politics of a certain kind of cheap kind, like, we just need to make sure there's more of X group in the past. But I don't think that's what it's about at all. I think it's something much more profound, which is what I understand you to be asking, which is to say, can we manage to tell a true story about ourselves that feels like a world that we would want to live in and that we could inhabit together? And writing that story as history and writing that story as historical actors today is obviously the great challenge of our moment and probably our lifetimes.
The final question came from an audience member who wanted to know how we could bring local history more to the forefront.
One of the things that we do at Egmont Educational Initiative is we work with a lot of the historical societies here in Connecticut, to really be inclusive of Native histories, because oftentimes these historical societies have Native items in their collection and have no idea how to interpret them. So when it comes to what towns have available to them, it is a bit hit or miss when it comes to Connecticut, and it's better in some places than it is in others. Just knowing, the landscape. Hartford is actually a really great place, to come and find different histories in comparison to where I live in Mashantucket and Ledyard, where a lot of that doesn't exist. You can go to Mystic and go to the Indian and Colonial Research Center. A lot of Eva Butler's work is there, but it's a very small building. It's very, not very well visited, as a result. And so these resources, at least for Native histories, exist here in Connecticut, but we're overshadowed, sadly, by things like the John Mason statue that's on the State Building. He led the Pequot Massacre. He led the massacre and burning of a fort that killed 700 men, women, and children. And he is lionized on our state government building. And so our kids end up learning about John Mason and don't learn about anything beyond the Pequot Massacre about Pequots. And so one of the things I try to do when I go into these historical societies is once again disrupt what they have been teaching, about that particular site, as if, because typically they've been teaching as if time started when that site began. And one of the things I try to do is remind them that there is over 12,000 years of Native history here. And a lot of it was disrupted by, the development of housing and, cities and things like that. And just imagine the archaeological record that would be available to us if we hadn't have dug everything up first and instead studied the ground and what we could have learned from all of that history and, and those types of things. So Yeah, when it comes to the state of Connecticut, what I found is that in comparison to what I grew up with, Native people, are for the most part absent. There is a Connecticut Studies mandate that has been passed, but I want to temper expectations on that. The state of Maine passed a Wabanaki Studies mandate in the year 2001, and in 2024 is finally creating the resources to fully implement it statewide, and only one school district has fully implemented it throughout their entire school experience. So where we're at in Connecticut with this work, when it comes to that, the State Department of Education helping, we're still another 20 years away from something that's really tangible or effective or impactful. Maybe it's less than that, but I'm just trying to, be realistic about it. And just say that, there's a lot of people that do want to do better. And that's one of the reasons why Agama Educational Initiative exists, is because there are those people that are hungry for, that information, but not enough of us. There really is not enough of us out here to teach it. And that's one of the shortfalls I think that we're running into a little bit, is that you have it great in some places, but not great in others. And that's true of pretty much the entire state.
Just have a quick plug to say that, especially given that we're 169 towns, to please talk to your legislators about fully funding the state university infrastructure that supports these kinds of initiatives. I cannot tell you how many times I have had to, sort of delay my sabbatical because there's nobody to teach my class. And, those burdens should not fall on so few shoulders, right? So our faculty is shrinking, and our student population is growing and growing, especially at UConn, and they plan to add more and more students as part of the revenue model. And while we appreciate the position that the university is in, they are under pressure from the legislature that has a very narrow vision of how the university actually works, in the same way that some of us have a very narrow vision of how democracy works. And so please talk to your legislators so that your library, right, can continue to benefit from that kind of public engagement, but so that people like us can have the space and the time to do public programming like this, and to share and disseminate our work and our ideas more effectively.
I totally agree with this, and yet I'm going to be annoying and pick on these two people, because I hope that my respect for them is clear. Chris says we have to be realistic. It might take 20 years. Fiona says, try to call your legislator and see if they'll fully fund UConn. No, this is the insidious hegemony of small thinking. Realistically, it's not realistic that my daughter who's 5 can make her way all the way through public school without having this curriculum that people worked so hard, to put in place. It's not, what's not realistic? That Connecticut would have a world-class basketball team. This is not realistic, but we insist on excellence, and we resource it so that we have hired this guy, Dan Hurley, for $8.3 million a year. If you gave me $8.3 million a year, I could hire 20 Nobel laureates to teach at UConn, at least probably 25. If you gave me the $35 million subsidy that UConn funds athletics, which, by the way, they should, because we should aspire for world-class everything. But if you match that dollar for dollar in the humanities, we could probably hire every living American Nobel laureate. If you gave me the $95 million a year that UConn spends in athletics that includes ticket revenues, I would throw in every MacArthur Genius recipient, and I would guarantee that your kids could have a one-on-one tutor relationship with them. And if you say, how are we don't actually have $100 million, I would say, it's really not realistic in the state of Connecticut that we continue. I have 5 degrees from Yale. I love Yale. It made me a scholar. And Yale is one of the state of Connecticut's proudest creations, because since 1718, the state's been lavishly funding it. Since 1834, with every kind of tax benefit. Since 1834, Yale has not paid, for example, capital gains tax on realized capital gains. Right now, that's 7%. Do some quick math. I think if I wake up thinking about this, and that's why I call it, what is it, morning hypertension. There's a $42 billion endowment at Yale. They have a 5.25% spending rule. They're required to realize 5.25% per year of their endowment returns. You tax that at 7%, which is what you get if you cash in. Maybe you have some stocks somehow, and you have to build a ramp, so you can push your walker up to get in your house. You get taxed 7% on that realized investment return. The state gives the money to Yale, and that works out to be approximately $150 billion a year. And what Yale shows, the state should be so proud of this world historically great collection of libraries and museums and students and scholars. It's truly one of the best things that Connecticut has ever done. We should do it again with UConn, and then we should do it again with Central, and then we should do it again with Southern. Because the biggest difference between Yale students and UConn students, I know because I taught at both places, the biggest difference by far is that UConn students are like a gazillion more times more likely than Yale students to be our kids' teachers. When you are in the hospital on some long and scary night, you're a billion times more likely to have a UConn graduate be the nurse that comes to check on you. And when we vote in future elections, and you're in the same electorate with a bunch of people who you hope have some wisdom, there's gonna be UConn graduates and Central graduates and Southern graduates. I mean, that's who's in your neighborhood and that's who's in your voting pool. And I think I think we should be realistic, and I think we should call our legislators, but I don't think we should be realistic on fully funding this austerity budget that UConn's inherited for after 2 decades of attrition. I think we should aspire for the same excellence that we expect from our basketball team across the board and know that, again, we are the wealthiest polity one of the wealthiest polities in human history. We can do whatever we want. And the future is wide open. Let's build one that we want to live in.
Andy Horowitz is Associate Professor of History at the University of Connecticut and the Connecticut State Historian. Chris Newell is co-founder and Director of Education for Acoma Educational Initiative. Chris is a citizen of the Passamaquoddy tribe at Indian Township. Fiona Vernal is Director of Engaged Public, Oral, and Community Histories and Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at the University of Connecticut. The panel discussion was part of a live event I hosted with the Connecticut Forum. Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Robin Doyon-Aiken, Meg Fitzgerald, and Meg Dalton. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. And you can listen to new episodes every Friday at 9 a.m. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Disrupted. I'm Kalila Brown-Dean. Thanks for listening.